is a tendency, especially in survey courses, to begin the story of African Americans at the moment of enslavement, to begin with chains, plantations, to begin with absence. But Unit 2 asks us to do something different. It asks us to begin with presence, not as victims, but as actors, as translators, as negotiators, as people already moving within a global world before racial slavery becomes fixed. Because if you don't understand that beginning, you'll misunderstand everything that follows. In the early 16th century, Africans known as Ladinos were individuals who were familiar with Iberian languages, customs, and systems. They arrived in the Americas alongside Spanish explorers. These people were not encountering Europe for the first time. These were people who had already navigated the Atlantic world. They were a part of what historians call the Atlantic Creoles, Africans who operated within multiple cultural systems and who for a time occupied roles that were not yet rigidly defined by race. This matters because it disrupts a common assumption that Africans entered the Americas only as enslaved laborers with no agency or mobility. Instead, what we see in this early moment is a kind of fluidity. Africans appear as conquistadors, as translators, as skilled workers, and yes, also as enslaved laborers, but not yet locked into a singular racial category. And one of the clearest examples of this is Juan Griot. When you examine Juan Griot's 1538 petition, you're not just reading a document, you are encountering a claim. Griot, a man born in the Kingdom of Congo, travels to Portugal and becomes a part of Spanish expeditions and ultimately arrives in what is now known as Florida in 1513. In this petition, he is not asking to be recognized as human. He assumes that. He is asking for compensation for his service, for recognition of his labor, for inclusion within the imperial system that he helped build. That tells us something powerful. It tells us that at this early stage, blackness is not yet synonymous with enslavement. And when you examine the image of Juan Griot on a Spanish expedition, you're not just seeing presence, you're seeing positioning. A black man not outside the imperial project, but within it, armed, participating, embedded. That visual matters because it forces us to confront a moment before race becomes fixed, when blackness does not yet automatically determine status. But that moment doesn't last. As European empires expand, their need for labor expands with them, and gradually what begins as a system of exploitation becomes a system of total extraction. And what begins as a set of economic practices becomes something else entirely, a new racial order. So by the time we move into the height of the transatlantic slave trade, we're no longer dealing with fluid roles. We're dealing with a massive coordinated system that will reshape the Atlantic world for the next 3 centuries. Between the early 1500s and the mid 1800s, more than 12.5 million Africans are forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean. Let that number sit, 12.5 million, and yet what's often misunderstood is where they actually went. Only about 5% of those Africans arrived directly in what would become the United States of America. The vast majority was sent to the Caribbean and South America, particularly Brazil, which alone received nearly half of enslaved Africans who survived the Middle Passage. So if you're looking at a map of the slave trade, one of the required sources for this unit, you should not be thinking in single terms of a national story. You should be thinking in terms of a hemispheric system. The map showing the regional origins of enslaved Africans transported to North America reinforces this point. It shows that Africans did not come from a single place. They came from Senegambia, from Angola, from the Gold Coast, from regions corresponding to modern-day Nigeria and Ghana. And this diversity matters because culture travels with people. Language travels, belief system travel, agricultural knowledge travels. Which means that when the Africans arrive in the Americas, they're arriving with worlds inside of them. They're arriving with agency, and those worlds do not disappear. They recombine. But before that recombination can take place, there's rupture. You see, the Middle Passage is not simply a journey, it's a process of transformation, violence, and deliberate and systematic discrimination, racism, and white supremacy. Africans are captured, often through warfare intensified by European demand. They are marched to the coast, held in dungeons, and then packed onto ships for a journey that can last up to 3 months. So when we look at the diagram of the British slave ship Brooks, one of the most iconic required sources in this unit, we're often struck by its geometry, the neat rows, the calculated spacing, the illusion of order. But that diagram is deceptive because it only represents about half the number of people who would actually be forced onto those ships. What it does not show is how the nets are used to prevent people from jumping overboard, the iron instruments used to force feed those who refuse to eat, the weapons used to suppress revolt. So when you analyze that diagram on the exam, you're not just describing what you see, you're interrogating what is missing. You're asking, what does the representation hide? And that's where pairing sources becomes powerful. When you read Phyllis Wheatley's poem on being brought from Africa to America, you encounter a very different tone. tone. Wheatley frames her experience through the lens of Christianity, suggesting a kind of spiritual transformation. But see, when you turn to Olaudah Equiano's narrative, the tone shifts completely. Equiano describes his differently: the stench, the suffocation, the terror, the violence. He gives you a sensory reality of the Middle Passage. Together, these sources are not contradictory, rather they're strategic. They reflect different audiences, different purposes, different rhetorical choices. And that's exactly what the AP exam wants you to see. When you move forward in time to Willie Cole's Storage, created in 1997, you begin to see how this history is remembered and reinterpreted. Cole takes the structure of the Brooks diagram and transforms it into something symbolic, something haunting. Not just a record of bodies, but a memory of containment, a reminder that the Middle Passage is not just history, it's legacy. Now here's where we have to correct another misconception. You see, resistance does not begin on plantations. It begins on the ships. Africans resist through hunger strikes, through coordinated revolts, through acts of refusal so extreme that some choose death over enslavement. And one of the most powerful examples of this resistance is the Amistad Revolt. You examine the plea of Cinque and the sketches of the Amistad captives, you're seeing more than a legal case. You're seeing a moment where enslaved Africans seize control, literally, of the system meant to contain them. They take over the ship, they navigate, they fight for their freedom in court, and ultimately they win. And when you examine the sketches of the Amistad captives more closely, what stands out is not just their condition, but their presence, their posture, their gaze. These are not images of passive victims. They are representations of people, of tribes who resisted, who acted, who forced the legal system to respond to them. That distinction matters because it shifts the narrative from containment to Black agency. Now think about that from the exam perspective. If you're asked about the significance of resistance, you're not just saying it happened. You're saying it disrupted the system. It increased costs. It fueled abolitionist movements. It exposed the instability of slavery. Resistance was the very thing that carried people forward. And yet, despite this resistance, the system does not collapse. Instead, it morphs, it adapts. And this is where Unit 2 becomes absolutely critical, because this is where slavery becomes not just economic, but legal. Not just legal, but racial. Not just racial, but hereditary. So if we step back for a moment, what becomes clear is that the system taking shape in the Atlantic world cannot survive on violence alone. You see, violence initiates it, but violence by itself is unstable. It produces resistance, but it also produces uncertainty. It produces questions about status, about belonging, about the boundaries between freedom and unfreedom. And those are precisely the kinds of questions that an expanding economic system cannot afford to leave unanswered. So what emerges gradually but deliberately is a different kind of structure, one that does not rely on force, but on definition, on classification, on law. And here it is in this transition that we begin to see something that is absolutely central to Unit 2, the making of race as a social construct, not as a biological fact, but as a legal technology, because race in the context of the Atlantic slave system is not simply a way of describing difference. It is a way of organizing power, a way of stabilizing exploitation across generations, a way of ensuring that the uncertainty that characterized earlier moments when Africans could be conquistadors, translators, or free laborers no longer threatens the system being built. This is why the doctrine of partus, sequitur, ventrem is so significant. Passed in Virginia in 1662, it established that the status of a child follows the conditions of the mother. On the surface, it appears to be a technical legal rule, but in practice, it fundamentally reshapes the entire logic of slavery, because this is what the law does. It eliminates ambiguity. And so if an enslaved woman gives birth, her child is enslaved, regardless of the father's identity. And when you place this legal structure along the image, am I not a woman and a sister, you begin to see how abolitionists challenge that system, not just legally, but morally. This image forces viewers to confront a contradiction. How can a society claim humanity while denying it to those who so clearly embody it? And more than that, it transforms slavery into something self-producing. No longer dependent solely on the transatlantic slave trade, the system can now grow internally. Enslaved women's reproductive lives can become a part of the economic engine, and that requires us to be precise in how we understand this moment. The law is not simply reflecting slavery, it is expanding it, it is securing it, it is embedding it into the future. So when you read the 1662 Virginia Statute as a required source, what you're encountering is not just legislation. You're encountering the moment when race and reproduction are fused into a single legal framework, a framework that ensures blackness over time becomes synonymous with enslavement. And once that association begins to harden, it must be reinforced. And this is where the slave codes enter, not as isolated policies, but as a comprehensive system of regulation designed to govern every aspect of Black life. Across different regions of the Americas, these codes vary in language and detail, but they share a common purpose: to define, control, and contain Black existence within the boundaries of slavery. So if you look closely at the Code Noir in Louisiana or the South Carolina Slave Code of 1740, what you see is not just restriction, you see anticipation. These laws anticipate movement, so they restrict it. They anticipate gathering, so they prohibit it. They anticipate communication, so they criminalize by anti-literacy Black laws and drumming. music, the very communal tool that brings black folks together. And that tells us something important. It tells us that enslavers understood that even if they did not say it directly, that enslaved people were not passive, that they were thinking, organizing, adapting, that culture itself could become a form of resistance. And so the law attempts to intervene, not just in labor, but in life, in language, in relationship, in thought. The South Carolina Slave Code in particular reveals the reactive nature of this system, passed in the aftermath of the Stoner Rebellion. It is not simply a framework for control, it is a response to fear, a recognition that the system is not secure and that it must be tightened. That rebellion is not hypothetical, it is real, and it is possible again. And when you read the letter from the governor of Florida alongside the account of the Stoner Rebellion, what becomes clear is that resistance is not imagined. It's documented, feared, and tracked. These are not isolated acts. They're part of a broader pattern of organized resistance that forces the system to respond. And so the law evolves in that response. But even as these codes proliferate at the colonial and regional level, something else is happening at the national level, something that is quieter but no less significant. When the United States Constitution is drafted in 1787, it embeds slavery into the structure of the new nation, but it does so in a way that is both revealing and evasive. This document refers to enslaved people, but it avoids the word slave and slavery. Instead, it uses language like persons held to service or labor. That choice is not accidental. It reflects a tension between a nation that claims to be founded on liberty and an economy that depends on bondage. By avoiding the term, the Constitution attempts to preserve a kind of moral ambiguity, even as it secures the material reality of slavery. It's a linguistic maneuver that allows the system to exist without being fully named. And when you read Thomas Jefferson's letter to Rufus King, you begin to see that the tension extends beyond the Constitution itself. And when you examine that letter more closely, Jefferson is not simply reflecting on slavery as an abstraction. He is grappling with its expansion. His concerns are tied to geography, to westward growth, to the fear that slavery might spread alongside the nation itself. This is what makes the document so revealing. Even as slavery is acknowledged as a contradiction, it is still allowed to expand. And that tension between recognition and inaction is foundational to the early republic. Even those who recognize slavery as a problem remain entangled in a system they are willing or unable to dismantle. But that ambiguity does not last. By the time we reach the Dred Scott decision in 1857, the question is no longer whether slavery can coexist within American ideals, it's whether black people can be included in the nation at all. And the court's answer is unequivocal. They cannot. In declaring that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, are not citizens and can never become citizens, the Supreme Court transforms racial hierarchy into constitutional doctrine. This is not just a legal decision, it's an ideological one. It defines blackness outside of the political community. It defines not only rights, it denies not only rights, but recognition. And in doing so, it reinforces the very system that earlier laws helped construct. At this point, the structure is complete. Race defines status, law enforces race, and the nation itself affirms the system. But while all of this is happening at the level of law and ideology, the economic machinery of slavery is also shifting, adapting to new constraints while expanding its reach. And when you examine images like sugarcane harvest in Antigua, and you begin to see the scale and intensity of plantation labor, this is not small-scale work. It's industrial agriculture built on surveillance, repetition, and exhaustion. When paired with auction broadsides advertising the, quote, valuable slaves, the system becomes even clearer. Labor is not just extracted, it is commodified, marketed, and circulated. So by 1808, the United States formally bans the transatlantic slave trade. Now, on paper, this may appear to signal a contraction of slavery, but in reality, it produces a reorganization. Because the demand for labor, especially in the expanding economy of the Lower South, does not disappear. It intensifies, it increases. And so the system turns inward, and what follows is the forced migration of over 1 million African Americans from the Upper South to the Lower South, which is known as the domestic slave trade, a movement so vast and so violent, it came to be known as the Second Middle Passage. The term is not metaphorical, it's descriptive. People are marched and changed, families are separated, entire communities are dismantled and relocated. And unlike the original Middle Passage, which crosses an ocean, this one unfolds across land. But the rupture is no less profound. If you read Solomon Northrup's account in 12 Years a Slave, what you encounter is not just the brutality of enslavement, but the instability of identity within that system. A free man could be kidnapped, sold, and absorbed into slavery. The line between freedom and bondage is not only thin, it's fragile. And when you place that along the side of the Charleston auction broadside, this contrast becomes even more striking. And when you compare it with the New Orleans broadside advertising, valuable slaves, quote unquote, the geographic reach of the slave market becomes even clearer. You see, this is not a localized system. It's a regional economy moving people across cities, states, and markets. The broadside lists human beings in terms of age, skill, and physical condition, reducing lives to data points, attributes that determine value in a marketplace. Together, these sources reveal two sides of the same system. One shows the experience of becoming commodified, the other shows the logic of commodification. And that logic extends into the organization of labor itself. Enslaved people are not simply put to work. They are placed within systems designed to maximize output and control. The gang system, with its constant supervision and collective labor, extracts productivity through discipline and surveillance. The task system, by contrast, introduces introduces a limited form of autonomy, allowing individuals to complete assigned work at their own pace once a quota is met. But even here, within a system designed for control, something else persists. Because wherever there is space, however small, there's the possibility of continuity. The rice fanner basket, for example, is more than just a tool. It's a trace of knowledge that's carried across the Atlantic. Its coil designs reflect techniques found in West African culture, particularly in regions like Senegal and Angola. And that tells us something essential. Even within a system that designs to strip people of identity and culture survives. It adapts. It embeds itself within objects and practices and rhythms of work and life. So by the time we reach this point in Unit 2, what we're looking at is not simply the existence of slavery. We're looking at its construction. A system built through law, sustained through economics, justified through ideology, and yet never uncontested. Because even as the structure hardens, the people within it continue to resist, to create, and to imagine something beyond it. And that's where the story must go next. By the time the system of racial slavery has been fully constructed, defined through law, reinforced through economics, and justified through ideology, it might appear at first glance that the story has reached a kind of closure, that the structure is complete, that the boundaries are fixed. But that assumption would miss the most important truth of this unit. Because even as slavery becomes more rigid, Black life does not become limited in the ways the system intends. It becomes more creative, more adaptive, more layered, and in many ways more powerful, because precisely it must operate within constraint. Even something as seemingly simple as naming becomes a site of struggle. So when you read letters from call and response, you see African Americans actively shaping identity, choosing names, rejecting imposed labels, asserting self-definition in a system designed to deny it. So what emerges then is not simply a story of survival, but a story of cultural transformation, of people drawing on memory, environment, and necessity to construct the new forms of identity that are neither entirely African nor entirely American, but something distinct, something diasporic. And we can see that process most clearly when we turn to the material and expressive culture of enslaved African Americans. When you examine objects like the cream and red quilt or the storage jar created by David Drake, you're not just looking at artifacts. You're looking at encoded knowledge. The quilt, stitched together through patterns that carry both aesthetic and mnemonic function, operates as a form of storytelling, a way of preserving memory in a context where literacy is often denied. The storage jar, inscribed by Drake, who was himself enslaved, complicates the assumption that enslaved people were disconnected from the authorship or intellectual life. His ability to write, his decision to inscribe his work, becomes an act that sits at the edge of legality and resistance. And when you read excerpts from My Bondage, My Freedom, you encounter something equally important, that the intellectual life of enslaved people that Frederick Douglass reveals is about literacy, memory, and how thought become tools of resistance, ways of reclaiming identity within a system designed to erase it. These are not isolated examples. They are part of a broader pattern in which African aesthetic traditions, rhythm, improvisation, symbolism are reworked within the conditions of the Americas. And nowhere is that more evident than in music. When enslaved Africans encounter Christianity, they do not simply adopt it, they transform it. They take hymns and infuse it with call and response structures, with syncopated rhythms, with a performative energy that reflects West African traditions. The result is the emergence of the spirituals, songs that operate on multiple levels at once. So if you listen to Steal Away Jesus, you're hearing more than just religious devotion. You're hearing coded communication. You're hearing a language that speaks simultaneously to suffering and to strategy. The lyrics draw on biblical imagery, escape, redemption, deliverance, but within the context of slavery, those themes take on additional meaning. They can signal movement, they can signal timing, they can signal opportunity. So in culture, in this context, it's not separate from resistance. It's one of the primary forms. And when you shift your lens beyond the United States to places like Brazil, images of festivals, capoeira, and Afro-Brazilian life reveal something critical. African culture does not disappear in the diaspora. It simply transforms. Whether through movement, music, or ritual, culture becomes continuity across geography. And that insight becomes even more important when we shift from everyday cultural expression to moments of overt political transformation. Because what happens in places beyond the United States reverberates deeply within it. The Haitian Revolution is perhaps one of the most powerful examples of this. Beginning in 1791 and culminating in 1804, enslaved people in the French colony of Saint-Domingue overthrow one of the most profitable plantation systems in the world and establish Haiti as a first independent Black republic in the West. This is not simply a revolt, it's a redefinition of what is possible. So when you read the preliminary declaration of the Haitian Constitution, you're encountering a document that asserts in unmistakable terms that slavery is incompatible with freedom and that Black sovereignty is not only imaginable, but achievable. And when you place that document alongside Frederick Douglass's later reflections on Haiti or Jacob Lawrence's visual representations of Toussaint Louverture, you begin to see how Haiti functions not just as a singular event, but as an idea, one that circulates across the Atlantic world, inspiring hope among the enslaved and fear among the enslavers. That fear has consequences. It contributes to stricter laws, to heightened surveillance, to a growing anxiety that the system, no matter how carefully constructed, is not immune to collapse. And yet, even outside of large-scale revolutions, resistance continues to take shape in ways that are both visible and subtle, organized with everyday resistance. Some of that resistance unfolds in maroon communities, spaces created by self-emancipated people who establish lives beyond the direct control of enslavers. These communities, whether in the Great Dismal Swamp or larger formations like the Quilombos of Brazil, represent an alternative geography of black life, one that exists in tension with, but not entirely within, the systems of slavery. In places like Florida, black Seminoles create communities that blur the line between resistance and sovereignty. Documents describing their capture and later petitions for rights reveal something powerful, that freedom is not just seized, it's defended, negotiated, claimed again and again. When you examine the diary entry recounting the capture of black Seminoles by Thomas Jessup, you see how threatening these communities were perceived to be. Their existence challenged not only slavery, but territorial control. Figures like Abraham and Gopher John, leaders and interpreters within these communities, demonstrate that resistance is not only physical, but intellectual and diplomatic. And when you place these alongside the Arkansas petition for freedmen's rights, you begin to see continuity. Freedom is not simply seized in moments of escape, it's claimed, argued, and demanded through political language. And when you examine images like the Maroon in Ambush or the portrait of Leonard Parkinson, you're not just seeing fugitivity, you are seeing organization, strategy, leadership. These communities are not temporary escapes, they are sustained efforts to create autonomy and to build societies that draw on African traditions while adapting to new environments. And at the same time, resistance is not limited to those who physically escape. It is embedded in daily life for what historians often describe as everyday resistance. Slowing work, breaking tools, maintaining cultural practices, forming families and communities under conditions designed to prevent them. These acts may not always appear dramatic, but they're cumulative. They sustain people, they preserve dignity, and they contribute to a broader movement towards abolition. And this becomes even more visible when we consider the role of black intellectual and political activism in the 19th century. Figures like Maria Stewart pushed the boundaries of public discourse, insisting that conversations about slavery must also address gender, that those experiences of black women cannot be separated from the broader struggle of freedom. So when you read Why Sit Here and Die, you're not encountering a speech, but a demand that black women should be recognized as thinkers, as political actors, as essential voices in the movement. And that insistence continues with the writings of Harriet Jacobs and Mary Prince, whose narratives expose dimensions of slavery that are often obscured, particularly in ways in which gender shapes vulnerability and resistance. These texts challenge the idea that slavery can be understood solely through labor or law. They reveal its intimate violence, its psychological toll, and the strategies women developed to navigate and resist it. At the same time, debates emerge within the black communities themselves about future, about whether freedom is best pursued within the United States or beyond it. So when you place Delaney along newspaper letters advocating immigration to Mexico and Frederick Douglass's reflections on West Indian emancipation, you begin to see a global conversation unfolding. Freedom is not a single path, it is a set of competing visions. When you read Delaney's arguments for immigration or Douglass's critiques of that position, you're witnessing a fundamental question being debated in real time. Is the United States a place where black people can belong, or must belonging be constructed elsewhere? See, there is no singular answer to that question, but the debate itself reveals something critical, that African Americans are not simply reacting to conditions, they are theorizing them, they are imagining alternatives, they are articulating visions of the future that extend beyond the constraints of the present. And those visions take many forms, including more radical calls for action. David Walker and Henry Highland Garnett make speeches addressed to enslaved people that push beyond moral persuasion and lend themselves to direct resistance. They argue that waiting for change is insufficient, that the urgency of slavery demands actions, even if that action involves confrontation, self-defense, and yes, even violence. These texts are not merely rhetorical, they're dangerous in the eyes of enslavers precisely because they attempt to transform thought into movement. And yet, even as these debates and actions unfold, the system itself begins to fracture under the weight of its contradictions. Economic, political, and moral. As the Civil War unfolds, images of black soldiers and laborers reveal a transformation. African Americans are no longer resisting slavery, they're actively reshaping the nation. Through service, through labor, and through their presence, they redefine citizenship in real time. And when you look closely at Civil War era photographs, such as the washerwoman working for the Union Army, what you see is the war effort extends beyond the battlefield. Labor itself becomes a contribution to freedom. Figures like Charles Wedgwood Douglass represent this shift. African Americans not only participate in the war, but reshape its meaning. So when you read The Colored Soldiers by Paul Laurence Dunbar, you see how that participation is remembered, not as service, but as sacrifice, dignity, and transformation. So by the time we reach figures like Harriet Tubman, whose life is documented both in narrative accounts and in the photographs that survived, we're seeing the convergence of many of the themes that define Unit 2. Tubman is not only a conductor of the Underground Railroad, she's a symbol of the possibility of the movement, of transformation and defiance within a system designed to prevent all three. When you read Tubman's own reflections alongside her later biographies, and when you view her photographs spanning her life, you're not just seeing a figure, you're seeing a legacy constructed over time. And when you place those images next to modern artistic interpretations, Tubman becomes not just an historical figure, but an enduring person of life and liberty. Her story, like so many others, remind us that slavery is never absolute, that even in its most restrictive forms, it can contains within it the seeds of its own disruption. So when we get to General Order Number 3, issued in 1865, that announces the end of slavery in Texas, it marks more than a legal moment. It marks a turning point in memory. So when you look at modern Juneteenth celebrations, you see that history is not just remembered, it's lived, it's celebrated, it's carried forward. And that brings us to the broader conclusion of Unit 2, because what this unit ultimately reveals is not just how slavery functioned, but how it was built and how it was challenged. And it shows us that race, far from being a fixed or natural category, was constructed to serve a system. And that system required constant reinforcement through law, violence, and ideology. But it also shows that within that system, African Americans were never simply acted upon. They acted, they created, they resisted, they imagined through creativity and agency, and in doing so, they laid the groundwork not only for the eventual destruction of slavery, but for the ongoing struggle to define freedom in its aftermath. So as you prepare for this exam, the question is not simply what happened. The question is, can you explain how it was built? Can you trace how it was changed? And can you show how at every stage people resisted it, not just in moments of rebellion, but in the ways that they lived, created, and endured in everyday life? Because if you can do that, you're not just ready for Unit 2, you'll understand it. I'm Dr. Kamasi Hill, and this has been a Griot's History Unit 2 review. And always remember, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the story alive.